Before we dive into some recent work done within specific cognitivist paradigms about perception, I want to discuss a single example which I think is useful to come back to now and again because it is simple and it has the capacity to shed light on some questions we have about perception without being too committed to stories about brains. When we're discussing vision or any sensory activity, we are discussing something which is important to an organism. It serves its purposes. It is for something. So vision here and perception in general are viewed not as the construction of pictures of the world, but rather as a means of getting by in the world, of surviving, of finding out, of responding to the world. And for all organisms, this is going to be important. Action needs to be guided. Blind action is dangerous. No matter where we look in the animal kingdom, we're going to find certain needs. The need to find food, to mate and reproduce, to avoid predators and seek shelter. So this kind of exploratory activity is common to all life forms. And when animals first appear in the evolutionary record, we know they're animals because they get around, they locomote. The nervous system and muscles come into being at the same time in the evolutionary record. So we're going to discuss an animal which is very distant from the human. We're talking about this little guy. It's a larva of a particular kind of jellyfish. We'll discuss him in detail, but I want you to recognize that we're dealing here with one of the simplest possible animals. And indeed, from an evolutionary point of view, it was with jellyfish and comb jellies that nervous systems and muscles first appeared. This is an extremely simple animal. I'm referring to the animal which is the top part of the figure here, A. We'll discuss B in the next slide. But we need, if we're going to understand this animal, we need to understand its world. Earthworms have different worlds to you. Your perceptual capacities will be no earthly use to an earthworm. So the world of this particular animal is, like the animal itself, particularly simple. These box jellyfish larvae live in the top few feet of the ocean, and in general, food is generated for this animal by other organisms which are photosynthesizing incoming sunlight. So the perceptual needs of this animal are fairly simple. They involve recognizing the gradient of the incoming light. So light hits the water, it's diffracted in various ways. It's quite complicated, but in general, if it's getting darker, this animal is going away from food, and so if it steers towards the light, it will get more food. But we are dealing with an animal of very little body here. No brains, no nervous system even in the larva. The adult form has a nervous system. So let's introduce this guy. He's Tripedalia cystophora. The box jellyfish is a problematic animal. They have a pack a nasty sting, and you find them in Ireland sometimes. More common in the Caribbean. And the larva stage here has only 2 tissue types, only 5 differentiated cell types, and no nervous system whatsoever. And we're going to be interested in the outside of this animal, the 2 cells that make up its exterior. As you can see, these cells are equipped with little hairs, little cilia, and they wiggle. So imagine this is like a gooseberry, right? It's got little hairs wiggling. Now, if you wiggle, you generate motion, but it's not directed motion. It's just random motion. And there's no central command center to organize this. It's just random motion. But interspersed among the cells with the cilia are special cells called ocelli, and one of those is shown at the bottom. These are similar in construction in that they also have a cilia, but they're different in that these are photosensitive cells. And we understand an awful lot about these cells. If you view the diagram, you'll see that the hair, the cilia, is nested in the cell and is connected by a bunch of little attachments connected to some vesicles, which respond precisely to the gradient of the incoming light, with the result that the single hair adopts a fixed angle with respect to the gradient. Now, I don't know if you've ever been in a boat, but this is how a rudder works in a boat. When a boat is moving, the rudder adopts a fixed angle with respect to the water and steers the boat that way. So if all the ocelli here adopt a fixed angle with respect to the incoming light gradient, what we have is a distributed rudder system. Now, you might object, and I wouldn't argue the case, that this is not vision as we understand it. Nonetheless, this is a manner in which this organism manages to survive in its world by being sensitive to the distribution of energy gradients around it, which are relevant to its purposes, in this case in feeding. The ambient light here provides the requisite information to steer the little guy. But there's no possible separation here between perception and action. This animal should not be understood as an input-output system, rather as something which is wiggling, doing its activity, and that activity serves to steer it towards the food. And if you think about it, although this is light-based, it looks a lot more like touch than what we think of as vision. And when we consider the senses, as we did in the last video, we would be forced to recognize that any being that has a body must be in touch with its surrounds. If the body has limits, it's in touch with its surround. So this is, in some sense, the primordial way of being in the world. Vision itself arises, as we understand it, through various kinds of specialization. In the retina on the eye, we have much more sensitive, more complex cells that respond to properties of light, and the effects of the light gradient are much less determinate in our case. So this is really a gross simplification, but it alerts us to the fact that there might be some common principles underlying all sensory systems in which we actively engage with our world. In the box jellyfish's case, that's nothing more than a little wiggling, but we are in contact with the world, and this contact gives us the basis for perceiving and for acting simultaneously. Now, I think this is a very illuminating example, but it won't be of much help as we go on through the next few videos, because what we're going to do is we're going to shift into the computational theory of mind, because this is where most of the work in visual perception has been done. Not all by any means, but most of it. And so the technical language we will use is one of information processing and the construction of representations. None of that was necessary for the box jellyfish larva. I don't know if that's strictly necessary to understand human perception. That's still being adjudicated. We have many theories. But the information processing paradigm has been most influential here. And interestingly, one reason we might be a little cautious is that it treats sensory information as input and separates it thereby from the activity of the organism. So perception and action become separated when we adopt this computational frame. But nonetheless, that's where most of the work has been done, and so we need to understand that work, and that's where we'll go with the next video.